In today's episode, we have Bett Williams, author of The Wild Kindness, a Psilocybin Odyssey, a lyrical, unforgettable memoir of Bett Williams' relationship with psilocybin mushrooms. Welcome to the Third Wave Podcast. I'm your host, Paul Austin, here to bring you cutting-edge interviews with leading scientists, entrepreneurs, and medical professionals who are exploring how we can integrate psychedelics in an intentional and responsible way for both healing and transformation. It is my honor and privilege to bring you these episodes as you get deeper and deeper into why these medicines are so critical to the future of humanity. So let's go and let's see what we can explore and learn together in this incredibly important time. This episode of the podcast is brought to you by Apollo Neuro, the first scientifically validated wearable that actively improves your body's resilience to stress. I received my own Apollo Neuro at the beginning of COVID in March, and it saved my life. It was incredible to wear this little device on my ankle that helped me to regulate and stay in a parasympathetic mode. It was unbelievable. In fact, I wrote up a review on Third Wave about how Apollo is like a microdose on your wrist. It was developed by a friend of Third Wave, Dr. Dave Rabin, medical doctor and PhD, a neuroscientist and board-certified psychiatrist who has been studying the impact of chronic stress in humans for nearly 15 years. He is a pioneer in alternative mental health treatments and an active practitioner in psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. You see, stress triggers the sympathetic fight or flight response of our nervous system, and Apollo activates your parasympathetic rest and digest response to help you bounce back from stress more quickly. It works by engaging with your sense of touch, delivering gentle, soothing vibrations that signal safety to the brain. It's been tested in multiple clinical trials and is proven to improve heart rate variability, the key biometric of stress. Apollo doesn't track your health. It actively improves your health and is safe and effective for adults and children alike. All you need to do to get 15% off your Apollo Neuro device is go to apolloneuro.com/third wave. That is apolloneuro.com/third wave, and you can get your Apollo Neuro device for 15% off, special for Third Wave listeners. Third Wave's podcast is brought to you by Magic Mind, called Silicon Valley's new morning elixir by Forbes. Do you want more creativity, flow, and energy in your day-to-day routine? Then go to magicmind.co and get the 2-ounce shot that contains 12 magical ingredients scientifically designed to improve your productivity. I've been using Magic Mind over the last couple months to reduce my morning coffee, and it works like a charm. With matcha, lion's mane, and several other nootropics, it lifts you up and doesn't burn you out. So if you're interested in Magic Mind, go to magicmind.co and enter promo code THIRDWAVE to get 10% off your first order. Hey, listeners, and welcome back to the podcast. I am your host, Paul Austin, and we have another great episode for you today. This one with author Bett Williams, who published The Wild Kindness, a Psilocybin Odyssey, a lyrical, unforgettable memoir of Bett Williams' relationship with psilocybin mushrooms. In pursuit of self-healing, she begins experimenting with mushrooms in solitary ceremonies by the fire. And I've read this book myself. You know, every evening I try to do a little bit of light fiction reading before I go to bed as a way to wind down. And read this back in August and September and probably made it about 3/4 of the way through. And, you know, in one of the reviews of The Wild Kindness by Gossamer, which is a phenomenal website about cannabis, a media website about cannabis, the description is: a hot lesbian living in the American Southwest decides to grow her own psychoactive mushrooms. You'll never guess what happens next. In general, this is a balm. It is the polar opposite of that Michael Pollan book, which I found to be a pretty apt way to describe it. It is Bett's specific journey with psilocybin mushrooms in New Mexico with a various array of characters, some of whom are plants, some of whom are spirits, some of whom are animals, and many of whom are real humans. And, you know, I had first heard about Bett at the Horizons conference in, I want to say 2018 is where she spoke, and was just like aware of her. And then her publicist had reached out about the new book that she was publishing, looked into it, thought it was very interesting. And Bett was one of the more interesting people that we've had on the podcast. She's a writer and a reader like myself. We hit it off in so many ways. And it was just like a good, honest, down-to-earth, soul-to-soul conversation that y'all will enjoy immensely. So without further ado, I bring you Bett Williams.
Really appreciate you inviting me on.
Totally. So let's just get started, just so our listeners have a little bit of context and backstory about what led you to writing a book about your psilocybin odysseys, about your healing journeys in New Mexico. What was the catalyst specifically to say, hey, I'm going to write a book about this and share my story with the world?
Well, I had written 2 books before that were completely not psychedelic related. One was a coming of age story, and the other was like a pop culture kind of rock and roll funny book called The Wrestling Party. And then 15 years passed, and writing has never been easy for me. But the more time passed, I thought, oh, well, maybe I'll try sculpture, or maybe I'll, not be a writer, because it was so difficult to finish a book. And then I fell in love with the mushrooms because they helped me do personal healing. And then I thought, okay, let me ask the mushrooms, can you help me write another book? I think it was Borges who said, a writer that doesn't write is a dangerous person. And I was noticing aspects of my life as an artist that were suffering because I wasn't attending to what I knew I came here to do, which is right.
Like writing in a way helps me to make sense of the world.
Yeah.
And for anyone who has a more artistic leaning, there's a tendency to, like going through anxious and depressive states. And there's something about writing that helps to, at least for me, to like stay centered and not sort of get too pulled in either direction. And obviously the process of writing is frustrating. It's challenging.
Yeah.
And there's also nothing that I found that's more nourishing from like a soul perspective.
It's true. It's not an easy flow for me. And my goal as a writer is to always tackle the things that are the most ineffable and gorgeous and amazing. And so the mushrooms both provided a structure that made things easier. I was saying the other day that like a mushroom trip has its own arc. So in a way, a mushroom trip was a way to take ideas in beats. Like, so the book is full of like a series of many mushroom trips. And that's the easy part. It helped a bit with structure that way. But to meet the mushrooms on their own terms with all the expansiveness was a real challenge.
Can you say more about that?
I would say there's a scene in the book where somebody said, how do mushrooms talk? And I think for right now, like anything I say is just from the perspective of an artist and how I'm kind of seeing it from here, which is I was looking at a mountain, and on this one particular mushroom trip where I fasted for 4 days, and the mountain broke into hieroglyphics, actual language. And there's a writer named Diana Slattery who wrote a book about a downloaded alien language after like 406 trips she took. And it took her 15 years to actually draw these letters. And she created a fully formed intelligence that she downloaded. And so when I was looking at that mountain, I thought, oh no, am I going to have to do the same thing? There's the film The Arrival by Amy Adams, where the aliens come and they speak in a language, and the letters that they transmit are both resonant on an emotional level. They kind of break time. When she looks at the letters, she goes into the past and the future. So I think on a very high level, psychedelic language is in that form. But it's also, for me, in a regular mushroom trip, they just talk to me. They're chatty, they're bossy, they're funny. And they help me. I think the second tier language of mushrooms is like a connection with my own brain as Bett Williams, and it's a collaboration. So it helped me to navigate. Eric Davis, who's a wonderful writer in terms of psychedelics and pop culture, says that the humor and the vernacular way that we approach a mushroom trip with our own language and our own heart, even if it seems sort of like, oh, I'm just a humble human being in the face of God and that moon is freaking me out right now, that language actually helps you stay centered so you don't fall off the rails. Because if you don't get to come and weave in a psychedelic trip into what your own life means, it's really hard to walk through the world, especially if you do psychedelics as a path.
There are a few things that are coming up for me as you're, talking about this relationship between the almost like mycelial intelligence
Yeah.
and our own human sort of way of navigating the world. I think it was Terence McKenna who, in one of his many sort of far out speculations, said that maybe mushrooms were, delivered here on an asteroid
Yeah.
a billion years ago, that they came from outer space. And it feels like many of us who work with psychedelics or who have been working with psychedelics over the last 10 to 15 years, Eric Davis is someone who comes to mind, as well as many of the others. We almost feel like aliens being here within a culture or a society that feels like so alienating to some degree.
As a female species, it said that it was really difficult for us to stand up from four-leggeds into two-leggeds. And this is a wild theory that women are the only mammal that menstruate to the moon's rhythms, because we lost so much blood that if our people taking care of us didn't go hunt a buffalo or get us some iron and meat, we were going to die. And so I think between Terence McKenna's idea that mushrooms created culture and then that women's menstruation actually created the need for language and figuring stuff out so we can get that meat to the woman so she doesn't bleed to death. Like, there's something very primal about why we evolved as a species with language. Terence McKenna said that he thinks the first words spoken were in a mushroom trip when a dude told his chick to please go get me a glass of water. Over there. There's a sense of one of the deep things about words is there's a sense of original sin having to do with language that I think a lot of psychedelic people uncover. Like, when you name something, there's the chapter I call the buffalo problem, where I had an impasse in my exploration with mushrooms where I was like, can I call a buffalo in the middle of a trip, or am I limiting what that thing I'm seeing that appears to be a buffalo is? And so that was my own kind of spiral. As I say, like, heroin addicts end up in a gutter with a needle in their arm, and psychedelic people end up, alone in their rooms with a buffalo problem. So language has always been a problem to like play with and solve and go, what is this thing? Because as much as psychedelics give us visuals, Henry Munn, when he wrote the essay, The Mushrooms of Language, about the Mazatec, said that they also generate language in a very clear and direct way. And I have experienced that. And it's been beautiful. And it's an unsolved thing. Like, I have no theory about it yet.
Well, it kind of reminds me of all these, like, even I had this personal experience with microdosing mushrooms where there's just, both in speaking and writing, there just seems to be like a sharpness,
Yes.
a way to articulate concepts or ideas. There's a lot of sort of sciencey, vernacular-ish words for this, but like lateral thinking, or, like we can kind of go here, we can go there. And there's like a mental flexibility with these things where, same thing with you, like whenever I come out of these high dose psilocybin experiences, it's like an incredible, like writing in the creative process, especially when someone is stressed or is in a depressive state or is having a rough time or whatever it might be, just not feeling the great. It's hard to find that motivation, that creativity. And psilocybin just like washes everything clean and just allows you to feel, oh, I can just like be expressive and play with words and play with things again. And it's a really pure sort of feeling.
They see, I feel like they see the whole picture. They know that I want to see the whole picture. So they tend to show me the other side of things. Like when I asked them about healing from my alcohol addiction, they were very funny. And they said, we love death and decay. We like drunks. You're going to die 15 years earlier, sort of a slow and painful death, but, it's funny to watch you all. And so they were showing me the perspective of how small I was, that my desire to be sober was funny to them. And they do want to help me with whatever desire I have. But they showed me that my perspective is not their perspective. And so, especially in this day and age when it's really important that we pay attention to others' political ideas and that not everybody thinks like you, I feel like the mushrooms are very helpful for that. They always show me the other side of the situation.
And this is a topic that's often talked about, the mycelial network.
Yeah.
Like mycelial intelligence. I mean, what does that even mean to you? What is mycelial intelligence? What are mycelial networks? Like, what are the ways that mushrooms are speaking in which humans should pay attention to?
I think it's very much about relationship, similar to the perceptions like in Robin Wall Kimmerer's book, Braiding Sweetgrass. Like, we are in direct relationship with everything around us, people, our computers, the plants, the trees outside. And mycelium is a network that looks a lot like the internet on another level, like a lot of crisscrossing things. And so they teach me that relationships are the only way to actually grow through an idea, to look at what that person says. What does that tree say? And there's something very nature-based about mushrooms in particular. All of a sudden, you're realizing there's the ground beneath your feet and the fungus underneath it that's making the trees grow. And that actually, oh, surprise, has something to do with the health of the people around you. And like, I've been thinking about the pandemic and our immune systems and how all the little microorganisms in our bodies are freaking out because we're not exposed to each other's germs in the same way that we have been. And so it teaches me, like, every single thing is a relationship. And that's great for a writer, because a writer's picking from everything around them, and mushrooms exaggerate that relationship, because sometimes things are irrelevant, but a mushroom will show you, oh, no, actually pay attention to those juniper trees outside your house. Like, they're kind of a big deal.
So it amplifies elements of our reality that we don't necessarily pay attention to when we're too focused or too narrow.
Yeah. So it takes you out of your eye perspective. I think that can also be exaggerated or minimalized depending on the way you approach a mushroom ceremony. Because I think a lot of people approach it with like a list of like psychological issues they're trying to tackle.
Heal my childhood trauma.
Go ahead, you're going to do it. I can't talk you out of it. But like, for instance, the last mushroom trip I did, I was expecting one thing. It was right before the Psilocybin summit. And I was like, had a lot on my mind about politics and the internet. And the mushrooms came on and they told me that the mice in my house by the refrigerator were making my partner sick, and that I needed to pull it out and do the stuff to the electrical outlet and fix that. And that would actually improve my health considerably and my ability to like have some space. And so that's what I did. And everything in the house shifted. I think people are in the pandemic are dealing with a lot of like jinn and weird stuff going on in their houses. And so the mushrooms went straight to that. They're like, you got to deal with the mice.
It almost feels like a conscious, subconscious, unconscious thing, like the mushrooms sort of tap into that subconscious iceberg that's below the tip, so to say, that we sort of like keep locked out. And then once you sort of get those defenses to come down, then it's like, that was probably in your awareness before the trip, but because you were so focused or preoccupied with other things, you didn't give yourself the space to actually go, oh, take a step back. What really matters? Okay, the health of my partner, right? Interconnectivity. Now what might be affecting that? And then boom, you kind of go, oh, there's this. And then it's like, it's new, but it's not new. Like you kind of knew it all along. And then mushrooms just were like, here, go do that.
And for instance, they told me that my dog didn't like the lamb dog food that I bought her, but the chicken. And it's like, you think these things are so mundane, but your dog getting sick and not eating their food is actually like what really has to do with the health of your day and stuff. And that's why mushrooms are so amazing. Like maybe it's in my subconscious and it came up out of an innate wisdom that is just stuffed down there. I don't know, but like it's so out of left field sometimes, the way they show me what is not ego-based, the way they show me the peripheral. And it's so important
Mhm.
because I'm so one pointed. We're all so, focused on what we think is important.
And there's so much that we often miss, right? It's
Yeah,
that
so
it's
much.
like Aldous Huxley calls, we have the reducing valve, right,
Yeah,
in our conscious brain, and mushrooms just whoosh, open that up.
yeah, I did a trip and I had planted with my father, who's passed away, a cottonwood tree in front of my house. He's Midwestern, and every Midwesterner has a shade tree in front of their house. And so I had to do the same thing in New Mexico. And so for 25 years, this cottonwood was sucking up the water from the pinon trees nearby. And one day they were like, bitch, cut that tree down. It's sick. It's not doing well. Look at the leaves are falling off, and we're not getting the water that we need to survive. And like I realized that for 25 years I had been like offending these holy beautiful pinon trees by my house by planting a really inappropriate tree that sucks up a lot of water. And this is the entryway to my house. So for years I'm walking by this sick thing, this imbalance that I created at the entryway of my house.
I'm from the Midwest, so when you just said that, I was like, holy shit, she's right. Let's get a little bit into kind of your background story, right? Because we
Yeah.
go into that book a little bit, but I think just for the listeners, so they have a little bit more context on who you are. You first started working with psilocybin many, 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 many years ago, right? And then
Yeah.
you basically had a break for 15 or 20 years or 25 years or something like that. So I'd love just to hear a little bit more about the story, like what brought you to mushrooms the first time, and then kind of why did they come back around when they came back around?
Yeah, well, I did mushrooms for the first time when I was 15 years old. This goth witch at my high school asked me to do them. She came out of nowhere. I did mushrooms with her. My boyfriend at the time was like, you should definitely do this. And I never saw her after the experience. And the experience was divine. We just walked through these ruins and kissed a little bit. And then like I came home to my bed, snuck in so my mom wouldn't know I was high. And I fell asleep with the sense of like, oh my gosh, I'm on a planet and the planet is made of dirt and it's full of worms and all this like living matter. And it was the first time I really understood that. And then I did mushrooms a few times more in my early 20s. And every time I did them, I was like, I should do this regularly. Like, this is incredible, but nothing took. And then I did the 15-year of blockage and some bad relationships and things like that. And an artist friend came to visit me who I had met on the internet and was like, let's do mushrooms. Where can you find some? And I asked somebody and they said, go to this guy at AA. He'll give you some mushrooms. So my understanding of them in my own life is that they're based on relationships. They're based on people and conversations. Mushroom spores themselves will travel on the hats of tourists or on the wings of birds. I think that mushrooms want to be out in the world. They want to go to the farthest yonder, as I say in the book. And it's much easier for them to find their way through our minds. So I think they find our way through culture. And to do them alone and to do them in the way that I do, which is a kind of soul building practice, an artistic practice, and a deeply spiritual practice, it's very difficult to do it in isolation. If there's any danger to psychedelics, it's not being able to have a community to build these ways with. And then I got stuck and I was like, I need to write a book because it's what I do. And I thought I could give it up, but I couldn't. So I asked them for help and I just was like, okay, it's going to be the backbone. At first it was, I'll just write a very simple book about how mushrooms are great. And then I realized, oh yes, I'm a Generation Xer. I come from the 90s. Like the books that I read were Bret Easton Ellis. And do you remember Go Ask Alice? Like it was a book about a drug addict. I was like, there's a kind of prose that arose through the beat poets, through like Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac, that informed me more than I realized. So attending to a literary work of art, I couldn't just do the mushroom manual. I had to actually write the book to see what that was, because the drug narratives of the 90s were always like, I lived through my drug problem. And like, so this was a completely different story. It was like these mushrooms, every time I do them, are saving me from dying, are saving me from my bad relationships. They're telling me what I need to do. So it was kind of a like Borgesian mirror to the kind of 90s literature that I grew up with, which was very substance based.
Like Requiem for a Dream and
and like Requiem for a Dream, and then William Burroughs, Naked
Train Spotter,
Train
Naked Lunch.
Spotting, all that. It was Annie Oak who said to me that my being drawn to Maria Sabina wasn't just because I have a grounding in ceremony, but also she's one of the greatest Latin American poets to ever have lived. And I've always been enamored with her sentences that are transcribed by Jerome Rothenberg of the chants she did as a Mazatec woman in mushroom ceremony. So the literary aspect in weaving substances in with it is an old tradition for writers. Writing in substances goes way back.
Oh yeah, Lord Byron was well known for that in the 19th century.
Yeah,
William James wrote.
Yeah.
Who else? Like, I mean, Plato and Aristotle were in the Eleusinian Mysteries. If we go back, that far.
Joan Didion wrote on gin and speed. I didn't realize that, that she wrote Play It As It Lays on gin and speed. And then there's Baudelaire was the opium writer. And then the psychedelics hit, but there's like Henry Michaud who wrote on mescaline. And then my favorite work of literature is actually Huxley's Doors of Perception. It's just,
I was just going to say,
it's like it's an art criticism. Like the whole thing is really talking about like classical painting and how he decides one day that it's not the content of the painting. It's not the virgin you see in the shell. It's fabric. He's like fabric and textures. It's like all this whole time I'm looking for content. It's really about the surface and textures, which leads you to like Andy Warhol and the can of soup, all these basically very psychedelic ideas about surface and depth and content, which we wrestle with in our artistic dialogues to this day.
As an artist, what are sort of the influences that you bring alive in your own work? Obviously mushrooms and psilocybin.
Mushrooms and music, because listening and guiding my life through the music that I follow shows me a lot about how to see the world and what is resonance. Somebody asked me the other day, like, how do you know when a mushroom's telling you a bunch of bullshit from when it's giving you a full transmission? And my only answer was that it's a resonance and a texture. Like when you hear a song and it really hits you, you go like, that's telling me a truth that I need to know. So it provided me with something to lean into as to like, okay, this is it. Because we don't have language for that moment when you discover something new and you go, this is the fucking shit right here. And so later in the book, when I do Syrian Rue with the mushrooms and I have this incredible transmission through the version of Guadalupe, it was like a training through arts, through resonance to know like, this is the moment where I finally arrived to the song of my soul in a way. And there's always the relationships that you make along the way, like meeting Kai Wingo in the community in Detroit. She passed away on the 38th day of a 40-day fast, and she ran the Women in Entheogens conference in Cleveland, 2015, that she invited me to. And to encounter a community that was using psychedelics together with their families in a way that wasn't like a counterculture thing, but just simply what an entire community was doing, really gave me permission with my artist friends to go like, this is a viable way to see the world. And so there's community building involved in being an artist and doing these ways outside of, clinical settings and structures, because you're literally building a world. Like art builds a world. When musicians do these things and they go to festivals, it's like songs will build a space for you to exist in. Like Kelsey Liu, who I write about in the book as having read that she has teeth marks in her cello from trying to eat it on LSD. Like, when I heard her songs before I knew this, I was like, her whole entire song is a psychedelic space. And so when artists make something, they're creating the world that you can step into. So we may, in a therapeutic sense, have our personal growth things, but when artists like make a clearing through a sound or through a sentence or through possibilities that occur in a narrative, like I think that's part of the work. It was Béla Barthé that suggested that Greek theater started through entheogens, and sort of saw there's a sacred and the secular realm that artists skirt. So I'm not like, yeah, even though I come from a background in ceremony, I'm being invited into Indigenous ceremony. I am mostly an artist. So I'm going back and forth through all these different spaces, basically showing what's possible and creating these pockets that I hope people go, oh, okay, here's this clearing created by this beautiful resonance of words. And the musician does it with song.
Right, which is sort of like the role of the curandero in ayahuasca ceremonies.
Yeah. So like Maria Sabina was singing, and you just step right into that song when she's saying like, do woman, woman of do, ha. And she's making I call it a sovereign country in another dimension. And we need each other to do that. I think our imagination needs help from everything around us. And when we create spaces for each other through art, it's like, oh, okay, they just made this space of possibility and imagination.
It reminds me of, there's a really great book by Bruce Chatwin.
Yes, Songlines?
The Songlines.
Oh my gosh, Songlines is one of my Bibles. So can we talk about that for a second? Because
let's totally talk about it. Yeah.
Gosh, the Aboriginal people of Australia have songs that they sing as they walk along the landscape that get them from point A to point B. And as they walk, the lyrics of the song will say, there's that rock, and that is like the guinea pig rock. And it's called guinea pig rock because their people had a thing happen there. And so as they walk, they're telling the story of the origins of their people the whole way. And I think all music, in a way, is a kind of geographical location. And,
right. That was like jazz even.
Yeah. Okay. Pharaoh Sanders. Oh my gosh. So Pharaoh Sanders, they were the first LSD jazz. And I saw them play while on LSD in Marfa, Texas. And they brought in such an energy of origins that every single person in the room had tears streaming down their face, and they weren't sad. And I was embarrassed because I was on LSD, and I'm like, okay, I can't stop these tears from coming out my face and the bass player was sobbing. And it was understood by everyone that the ancestors were fully present. Like something very, very, very old was with us. And because of the music, it was able to link us in. And it could also be because of music, it has a psychedelic aspect to it.
Totally.
I was saying the other day that there's a balance when taking mushrooms of not going too far in yourself that you lose paying attention to what's going on around, because I think that's the space of creativity, is where you're in your own world, but you're also paying attention. Like in a peyote ceremony, everyone's singing and the water drummer is going around, and you're meeting something while you're possibly feeling very sick or like you want to lie down, but you can't. You have to actually attend to what's going on in the room because you're making something together, and you can't just be by yourself.
You're a part of the community. And this is something that you talk about quite a bit in the book and in your work, is just the importance of ritual.
Yeah.
The importance of doing this within a community, like some element of sacredness, or mostly an element of sacredness. One question that I did want us to dive a little bit into is just hearing a little bit more about your perspective on sort of the current state of what's going on with psychedelics. So it's mid-October 2020.
Yeah.
When we're recording this, Compass Pathways just went public on the NASDAQ stock exchange.
Yeah.
And hit, I think, a valuation of like 1.5 billion, which is incredible and ridiculous at the same time.
Yeah.
There's decrim measures going on in places like Oakland, where they're looking to sort of formalize healing in ceremonial circles. TheraSil, which is a Canadian nonprofit, just got approval for Canadians to legally use psilocybin for end-of-life anxiety.
Yeah.
And, where I'm sitting from, I'm a big fan of both and, the concept of both and. So
Yeah.
like to create a container that is accessible for as many people as possible, like all of these options need to be on the table. And there's obviously upsides and downsides and pros and cons and all of that to each and every single one of them. So I don't know if I have a specific question, like tell us about this or tell us about this, but just generally, like from your perspective, from the mushrooms perspective, from the work that you've been doing with these the last 5 to 6 years, the communities that you've been involved with, like what's your sort of take on the state of the current psychedelic renaissance?
If I wasn't interested in playing with everyone who's doing these things, and if I didn't have curiosity what Compass is doing, what people are doing, psychedelic therapy is doing, I would just be doing my own private practice and not paying much attention.
That's the right answer. That feels like a good answer.
Like there's a human political realm of dealing with structures and capitalist structures, which have diversity, issues like that. And then there's the fact that the Wiley mushroom or the Wiley ayahuasca or the Wiley LSD is simply just a chemical compound. And so it's a whole conversation. First you go like, well, are the mushrooms like an entity that does or does not want this corporatization, let's say? And as I stepped into the community of the psychedelic movement, I know that I represented the rogue psychedelic user. And there was a place where in the discourse of our current politics, you're supposed to be like against something, And it's like, well, if you're doing something that you like and it's completely different from another thing, and you're saying like, I'm giving you this other option, like you don't have to pay for it. You can grow them at home and give them away and it's just as great. That doesn't mean that I don't think these other ways are really effective. And I could get in a lot of trouble for saying this, but I was in my hot tub the other night on an edible, and the mushrooms told me that they think it's really wild that so much money is being made or potentially being made from all these like psilocybin analogs being used in all this stuff. Like the mushrooms perspective is so complex and so long term. Like what does 10 years from now mean with the way we're doing things? So I'm just holding down the fort of like, hey, you can do these things on your own in your house with your friends. And before I was like, oh yeah, well, doing them in a clinic is this and that. But like my brother, that's the only way he would ever do it. And like my friend's mom, that's the only way she would ever do it. I don't quite see it other than that I've softened and really have a lot of love and curiosity for how this is all going to unfold. At the end of the day, it's a fairly friendly process, even though we've got a lot of big players and things like that happening. It's not exactly like we're fracking or anything.
Unless you count like extracting psilocybin from mushroom, like maybe we're fracking the mushroom.
No, it's ridiculous.
That is a thing.
Like plants are so generous, and humans and culture. I don't know. I've decided to just step back and have a place of curiosity, because the level to which I've really set down my stakes and gone like, you can do this stuff and give it away for free. Like, Yale knew that from the beginning. I mean, even decriminalization has its complexities. Mm-hmm. I personally am not like a person who goes door to door advocating for decriminalization. It's just not my interest or my style. But also, there's something to the fact of going to a drug dealer, doing something illegal, and doing it in the privacy of your own home. Like, what if you look at the fact that these things have had to be secret, not in terms of always the idea that you're colonized, of course, like, and people make things illegal because psychedelics are power, spirituality is power. But what if sometimes things just need to be done in a humble way, a little bit in private, because they're really powerful? Somebody said to me, maybe it's really okay to just keep going and just tell people to be smart and to really be aware that people of color are put in jail more than other people, and to pay attention to that and do everything you can. One of the old ways these things have been done for thousands of years, almost every regime, is with some danger. Usually only the elite in a given culture, or the shaman, would do these
Mhm.
things. And so we're in new territories. I don't have a problem with the fact that we're still working through the illegal stuff. I would like it to not be for many reasons, but it's a space to hold that maybe them being illegal is a form of privacy.
I'm just sort of like feeling this energy going up and down because
Yeah.
there's a few things there. There's almost this mycelial underground.
Yeah.
I was talking about this with Louis Schwartzberg on
Yeah.
another podcast that we did, where he was like, "Man, like we're all in this together,
Yeah.
and it doesn't really matter if everyone's doing mushrooms or like whatever. It's like those of us who care about this, those of us who believe in this, those who have some relationship with mushrooms, right? Like there is a cool little like it's not elitist, but it's sort of like I can be this way, and then like
Yeah.
behind closed doors, it's like I have this little secret little wand that I use, and
Yeah.
that's sort of like that's fun and that's interesting. And whenever we have these deep spiritual experiences, especially with something like I see this most commonly with ayahuasca circles. I think people, just from the natural goodness of their heart, want to go, oh my gosh, this was so transformative. I need to tell my family and friends and
Yeah.
everyone about this. And I think that's partly because like we just live sort of like in a shitty time where mental illness is skyrocketing.
Yeah.
We're trying to fucking figure it out and no one's really been able to figure out. And then you drop these and you're like, holy shit. This worked unlike anything that has ever worked before. And then we're evangelists. And I think part of the process of learning to work with psychedelics is like not keeping a lid on that, but being mindful of how you speak about it and who you speak about it
Yeah.
to, maybe sharing your experience. There is a tendency for the ego to creep in and then be like, do you want to do this? Do you want to do this? Do you want to do this?
And also, doesn't need to be a bad word. Like the elitism of psychedelics has no racial lines, has no class lines. Like in my book, I talk about landing after the Horizons conference into a barbershop in Lubbock, Texas, with a war veteran who was like, yeah, MDMA is great, but what I really want is to grow mushrooms in my closet. And I'm sick of everybody promising veterans that they can have all this stuff and I'm just going to grow this stuff myself. I think the movement tends to use those tropes of like access to say that they need to be legalized and move their stuff forward when like the stuff has been done by all different segments of society for a very long time. And there's something to having to work for it. There's something to having to source your drugs, to find the drug dealer, talk about a way to deal with like class, race issues, to like, go into a big city and try to find some mushrooms. It's very humbling.
And thankfully, like with education, that to me feels like the key, right? Like, how do you just help people learn like these are the basics of working with psychedelics,
Yeah.
and these are some of the rituals that have worked for thousands of years, and
Yeah.
like probably don't take too much the first time that you do it, be in
Yeah.
a really nice beautiful natural setting, be with a few close friends that fairly well, and then just like see what happens.
Totally.
Like a huge part of the healing of all of this and working with this is like the unknown and the emergent, and
Yeah.
like not trying to figure out every single last detail.
Yeah, like you can go online and go to Chacruna or Double Blind and get some really good advice on dosage, or you can listen to some really amazing folk music, parallelograms by Linda Perhacs, and you'll get a transmission on like the right attitude to approach a mushroom in a second. So I think that's where the culture makers come into play. And there's a bit of a divide between the psychedelic movement and the culture players. Like the musicians who do psychedelics, they have no desire to like speak at the Horizons conference necessarily, but so there's this like there's maps everywhere and even through artists who don't really do psychedelics. There's people who create art that is psychedelic just by its very structure and nature, like the writer Terry Tempest Williams, for instance, who writes about the desert, or Charles Bowden, who also writes about the Sonora Desert. I mean, the psychedelic lives in high culture, it lives in high art, it lives in high theory politics, like the fractal way of thinking. It's like instant PhD level downloads that are accessible to almost everybody I've known who's gone into this world.
Yeah, without all the potential college debt and 10 years of your life.
Exactly. Yeah. Actually, just really painful to try to hold a anti position with, say, compass pathways. it gets in the way of my own practice. And so I've stepped back and gone like, wow, this is so like rich, and this is so potentially like crazy right-wing politics or this or that from Peter Thiel. But I've sat down and like, I need to listen to Peter Thiel talk. Like, what does he have to say? Like, he's interested in mushrooms. He probably has some interesting things to say, even if I disagree with a ton of stuff about where he comes from. There's too much genius in that human being not to listen to him.
Yeah, because I mean, all of those people they're all mirrors.
Yeah.
To some degree, they're all, part of this collective that we're all in together. They're all part of
Yeah.
the story that we're weaving with
It's
mushrooms,
an
if you
old
will.
story. Yeah, I did 30 grams recently for the first
Oh
time.
my God. Okay.
Yeah. And I saw everyone. I saw all the players and like how much I love them. And the mushrooms were like, the oldest story is you work and you work your whole life and you talk to all the sages. People want to trick you and sell you something. At the end of the day, it's just a little mushroom. Just a little mushroom. It saved your whole life. It saved your spirit. And now you can die. Now you can, the humble mushroom that's the story of what we're telling. And I think even that little humble mushroom exists in Peter Thiel's narrative at the end of the day, because it's the oldest story and it's the nature of God, really. That some little thing you didn't expect is just gonna like go like, you knew the whole time. It was just you and your little heart, you knew how to do it. And so I'm just holding that story is with all of us, because I think there's some forces coming in, like who are riding like the big cannabis train, like people who've never done psychedelics who are hopping on it for money. I think those are some serious energies that we haven't dealt with before in the movement. So all the people who seem like big bad guys before are like now like our sweet friends. Like big C capitalism is always sort of overwhelming.
Yeah.
But I
I
honestly
mean,
don't know enough about it to really understand the damage in particular. Like, you have a company that does maybe really crappy things all around the world, but if they're doing something with mushrooms, like, will that thing carry the resonance of all that horrible stuff too? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that.
none of us do. And I think the optimistic way that I often look at it is this is going to be a long journey, right?
Yeah.
Like this isn't a 3 to 5 year, path.
Yeah.
It's already been a 10,000 year path, so
Exactly.
but within the current sort of dynamic and structure that we're in, what I find to be very positive is it's almost like all the sort of, this is the way that I look at it, the money that's starting to pour into the psychedelic space is, and I don't think a lot of these people know that this is what they're doing, but it feels like a lot of the money coming into the psychedelic space is to create an opening for the mushroom to be more accessible, for there to be more education. In other words, like tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of the dollars that are being invested are going to FDA clinical trials and going to basically creating an entirely new infrastructure of the way that we treat human beings when it comes to healthcare and mental well-being. And I think that's a really positive development. And my hope is that like the decrim, the decentralized models, right? Like these are a mirror of sort of the information age that we're stepping more and more into. And that the like FDA and stuff like that are just representative of the industrial model that colonialism was built upon, that's been going on for a few hundred years, but now we're like in a serious state of decadence. And so that to me is like the big uplifting thing. It's like a lot of the money that's coming in feels like it's social impact, even though maybe they don't realize it yet.
Exactly. Like I've been thinking of, for instance, Amazon.com and Jeff Bezos, of like, well, what can we can petition him. We can say like, hey, we might not buy from you unless you subsidize the post office a little bit, like down the line, how can we influence these things for our next generations? And I like big companies and such are not going to go away. So I've decided to be curious and excited about it as opposed to like, oh, they're thefting something from an old way. I don't see it that way.
So what are your rituals then when it comes to, and you don't have to get too specific, but just more sort of like conceptually, when you're going into a mushroom journey, when you're going into an experience, are you going in with an intention? Are you going in with, mantras? Do you have special crystals that you use?
My mantra is keep it simple, keep it clean. And I, having come from being invited into indigenous ceremonies, tobacco is like a go-to. So I always keep like a big old bag of like pipe tobacco. I bought at like Santo Domingo Pueblo down the road. And I like, because mushrooms are a conversation and a give and take, like there's a sense of exchange. And in the ways that I've been taught in those ways, the exchange has to do with tobacco. It has to do with smoke. I burn juniper that grows around my house. The mushrooms have, doing them alone in my house, they've been like, oh, check that plant out. Check this plant out. That's part of, we want to include this in our conversation. Every plant has a deva. And for instance, like when I burn copal, in the middle of a ceremony on, let's say, 5 grams, it changes the whole entire field. And for me personally, when I burn copal, I have a really strong sense of a presence of what the mushrooms like to call the grandmothers. This is just bizarre sort of interstitial energies that I work with. So I'll burn copal and they'll be like, grandmothers are here. Give them brandy in a fancy glass. And so like, I don't actually keep brandy with me, but I will, maybe put some chocolate and pay attention to being in conversation with who I want to help me, which is a sense of like my ancestry, the plants around me, people I love like Kai Wingo or, things like that. I call them my saints, so the mushroom trip opens up conversation both with like regular friends who I want to talk with on a spiritual level, and then people who've died, and then energies like Guadalupe and Papa Legba. So my personal practice is what I've come with as me through a lifetime of practicing and finding my archetypes that I personally like to work with. I like to do them between daylight and sunset, so I have a little bit of both. And I do them at home. One time I did a mushroom trip recently in a grove of aspen trees, and that was way more than I was ready to sign up for. I realized I needed to fast and do all these things because it was so overwhelming attending to a space that wasn't my own. So I like to keep it very simple in my own house. So I have a good balance of looking inward, but also being aware of the ecosystem of where I live.
Back to the sort of interconnectivity, both lineage, ancestral, the time and space that you're in.
Yeah.
Right. Because when we eat these, we're transmuting, transforming. Time and space is very weird and different. We end up in different universes. It get funky.
Yeah. If you stay home, I think your spirits stay closer to you. Even for me, like 8, 9, 10 years in, it was ambitious to even go to a spot in nature, which you think like, oh, I'll do mushrooms in nature. It's like, oh yeah, no, the whole spot that you do mushrooms in is going to work you. It's going to talk to you, and you may not even get a chance to go into your own thing because you're so busy dealing with like the weird patch of beach you just picked to sit at.
Right. Wow. Well, Bett, we're kind of nearing the end of the hour, so I want to make sure that, before we close off, you just have a little bit of an opportunity to share. Where are you going from here? What's up next for you? Are you writing a round 2 on psilocybin mushrooms? What are you most excited about? What sort of the next 6 months look like for you?
Doing a podcast with my partner called No Cures, Only Alchemy. It's about the intersection between psychedelics and culture. And we're really attending to the emergency that was spoken of in the film, The Social Dilemma, and how the algorithms of our phones have really played us to an extent. We all really need to question what we've been thinking in the last 10 years and how much of it is our own thoughts. That comes up a lot in any psychedelic experience. You wake up and you go like, I thought that was my thought, but it's not my thought. And now it's gotten pretty literal with like how we're divided and in our own little bubbles. So I've been writing some things for Lucid News on that topic, and hope to continue crawling out of that hole to the other side, because I feel very, very psychologically and spiritually damaged from my social media use, honestly. And so that's the recent project. Then I'm doing a psychedelic book club where on November 14th, we're going to talk about the wild kindness. You can find me on bettwilliams.com. And if you want to join the book club. And then we're going to go into Octavia Butler's Dawn series, which has many psychedelic concepts in a sci-fi interplanetary way. Maria Sabina's Book of Veladas. We'll probably touch upon Aldous Huxley and Ariana Rines' Sand book, because I think I want to link up reading, culture, and literature to ideas of what psychedelics is. And that's the space I'm creating, partly to create another social way to exist on the internet outside of Facebook and Instagram.
Like, it's a private social network, but it's more than that. It's like a private mycelial network.
Yeah, you can hop on. I have a Patreon, so you can like hop on the Zoom and just do the book club, or you can hop on the Patreon and get involved in the book club discussions without any algorithms affecting you and stuff. I'm just so curious, like, okay, so we've created some culture. Let's let this take its own life. I'm like, for instance, there's so many fathers that have responded to this book, and like, I didn't know there would be so many dads. And so I'm excited about like what that means, that so many people who are fathers are interested in talking about psychedelics in relation to how I've written about it.
Why do you think that is? What do you think resonates there?
Well, I think as a lesbian, in the book, the book has a lot to do with some real hell I went to with an ex-girlfriend. And I think that men don't often get to talk about what they go through with women and what it's like to be a man. And there's a weird way I'm a man in the book, to a certain way, in a way that like men read it and they go like, wow, you understand some of the things we've gone through. And I love that. Like, I've always written for the furthest person away from my own experience. So the people are often like, oh yeah, this is this queer book, right? And I'm like, well, I'm already queer. I'm interested in how the person who's the most different from me relates to me as a queer person. And so all these fathers relate to me very deeply. And I'm really touched by that.
It's beautiful. I think just the way that you put it, like wanting to not sort of preach to the choir necessarily, but creating inclusivity and interconnectivity by resonating with people who are across the spectrum. And that feels relevant even into what you're talking about with your podcast and the Patreon. It's like, we don't want to further polarize, but we actually want to bring people together who have different ideas and engage and connect and explore and all.
We need to include everything in the circle right now and try not to be touchy about it. And that includes all the stuff going on in the movement right now, because it's a microcosm.
And a very amplified microcosm.
Yeah.
Well, Bett, thank you for your time, and thank you for writing this and writing so eloquently about it. You're an excellent writer, a beautiful writer.
Oh, thank you so much.
And also for speaking about it and being so outwards about it and external about it, and still finding, obviously, and discovering those moments, as we talked about, of privacy and sacredness, because as we both know, like, and as we talked about in the podcast, a lot of these experiences can't be verbalized, and that's sort of the beauty of them. So thank you for your time. And
thank you.
And as our listeners will know, so Bett is the author of The Wild Kindness, a Psilocybin Odyssey, and we will include all the links in the show notes in the post that we have up that we'll have on the Third Wave. So Bett, just one more time, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.